Hey everybody, Adam here, and today I have the pleasure of presenting an interview I did with Jervis Johnson. Hey everybody, today I'm joined by a very special guest for me, as I've been playing along. For those that watch the channel, I do have been playing for a long time of Games Workshop, because as many of you know, as well as historicals, I also play 40K. I just recently came back from Las Vegas Open, where I was the judge there. So, and I'm joined with today Jervis Johnson. Welcome.
Hello there. Hi. Hi. Nice
Um,
to be here.
For those that somehow don't know, I don't know how you wouldn't know. He was in the early development of Games Workshop. Uh, I believe you started around mid '90s,
No, no, no. I
earlier.
actually quite a lot earlier. I started workshop in the early '80s, actually, mid early '80s. But I started out. I worked in trade sales basically. I used to phone up game shops and toy shops in the UK and convince them to carry Games Workshop stuff, and then sort of like made the move over to games design by coming up with the idea for Blood Bowl, basically. While I was working in trade sales, I came up with the idea for that and designed it in my spare time, and that meant that I moved over to the design studio.
Okay,
Uh,
and
and
that was the original, because I know there was a version called, I think, Crunch.
Oh, that was
Was
no, that came rather later. Crunch. That was
okay,
it was kind of like a simplified version of Blood Bowl
okay, because I
with a
have,
more mass market.
yeah, I have that box, and it was much different than uh,
Yeah.
than Blood
Not
Bowl
actually
itself.
designed by me. I think that was Andy Jones who
Oh,
designed
okay.
that. But yeah, no, that came rather later. But the original version of Blood Bowl is, oh, I'm going to forget what year it was. Sort of like in the mid late '80s, when
Okay.
that came out, the first edition, and then I think then I started appearing more in White Dwarf magazine, writing more stuff, and then people started sort of like noticing who I was. I think from about then. So I think
Right.
that my early career at Games Workshop, I wasn't doing games design,
Oh, okay.
so people don't tend to know about it.
Yeah, I remember reading the early magazines, and it was, and obviously it's always in the battle reports with you and Andy, um,
Mhm.
and some of the bigger battle reports. Um, but yeah, you mentioned Blood Bowl. I've played Blood Bowl for a number of years. I played since second edition is when
Right.
I
Yeah.
first started. Although I think I still I think I have an early Dungeon Bowl. I think
Okay.
that's
Yeah.
first edition. I'm not sure. I
Uh,
do have the Astro Granite field, the original
yeah.
styrofoam field, and some of the original players with the really hard plastic monopose,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
dwarves
Yeah.
and elves and all that stuff. But that was, so I guess, how did they just find out you were making a game, or did you come to them say,
No.
I have this game I want to pitch?
No, 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 not like that at all. Actually, I mean, basically, when I joined Workshop, I'd worked in a game store before. I worked at Workshop, got to know the people who ran the company, and then got invited in to join the company. And I was doing well in trade sales, but I was speaking to the managing director at the time. It was a chap called Brian Ansell, and I said, well, we could really do with some smaller little boxed games in the range to sell into stores. And I just came up with a few ideas. And one of them was like, because I liked American football and watched that on, we was just starting to get that on the telly over here. I said it could be like a game a bit like American football, except it's orcs and goblins
Right.
playing the game rather than humans. And Brian said, "Oh, I like the idea for that one, Jones. You better go off and design it yourself then," which I hadn't really anticipated him saying at all. So my day job was doing trade sales, and then in the evenings and weekends I started working away on the first edition of Blood Bowl, which was my first ever bit of games design. Um, And it kind of came together okay. Brian liked it, and then I was very lucky to be joined with join up with a good team of people. So there was
Mm,
a chap called Mark Gascoigne, who was a great editor. Ali Morrison came up with a lot of the artwork for the game, and it just all came together in that first edition, basically.
okay.
And so I was lucky. So that was one of my first lessons. I mean, like, you can have talent, but you've got to be lucky too. Basically,
Right.
you've got to get that opportunity. And the other lesson that I learned there is that I think people think that games design is kind of like a solo project, as it were. You come up with the game yourself, but in my experience, it's a team effort. There are lots of other people who are involved, particularly on a board game.
Mm,
So it's a bit more like being involved in making a movie than it is writing a novel, is what I usually say. So it all relies on the other people that you're working with. That's what makes a game great,
right.
in my experience, anyway.
Yeah, I enjoy. I always enjoy it. I think the it's. I personally, and I think I know a lot of people agree with me in that they feel like Blood Bowl, at least second, third edition, was like probably one of the better design games in terms of just in
Mhm.
general. Some people might argue. I think they mentioned Lord of the Rings, Middle Earth Fantasy Battle, or Middle Earth,
Yeah,
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 Strategy
yeah,
Battle.
yeah. Lord of the Rings is good. Space Hulk is the other
Yeah,
one that
Space
often
Hulk's a good
comes
one.
up.
I still play first
Yeah,
edition Space Hulk.
yeah.
Uh, it seems like those older games seems a bit more and not and the more the like self-contained games.
Mm. I think that the on board games, it's easier to write rules for a board game
Mm,
because you've got a grid for a start,
right.
and so no arguments about line of sight and all that kind of stuff, or creative measurements of your movement distances or anything like that. You've got a
Right.
nice grid, and it makes life a lot more straightforward, I think. Um, and and having a tight focus again makes the game more straightforward. I mean, something like 40k has to cover everything from a Gretchen through to a Titan, within the game
Yeah.
system, and that is and a game size from like 20 models aside through to hundreds. So it kind of like it's a huge ask, and the game is like it to cover that breadth. It can't be as focused, so the mechanics won't be quite as neat because they've got to be very, very flexible.
Yeah, like I mentioned, I recently was at the Las Vegas Open because I helped judge their 40K event, and and it's a lot. I mean, the latest edition is a lot cleaner than previous editions,
Hmm.
but it's still a lot of like it's just a lot of people because it was over
Yeah.
a thousand players this year, and it's more at this point for me anyway because I've been doing it for so long. It's more of the people management aspect of it as opposed to the rules management aspect. Yes, there's still like those corner cases as there always
Hmm.
is with the rule set, but for the most part it's much better than it was before.
Yeah.
But
I
it
think the modern rule sets are much tighter than they used to
yes,
be. Basically,
yeah,
they're more tightly written. Again, there are swings and roundabouts to that. I think in the tighter you make a rule set, it it cuts down the number of fun options you can put in, if you know what I mean. Certain
yes,
mechanics that are a lot of fun get end up getting cut because you just can't find a way to get them to work in every circumstance with every
yeah,
player and with every army. So I think the classic example of that, from my experience, was Bretonian knight wedges in
mm,
Warhammer. Such a beautiful idea, looked absolutely great. But every time you tried to write the rules for them, they ended up not quite working.
hmm
You have to, I call it hand waving. It's kind of like you just have to assume that the players will make the rule work because it's cool.
right,
And I think that with the modern versions of the game, and particularly with so much organised play going on now, got these
Yeah.
big events like the ones that you're talking about, and you've got, it means that the game system had to become tighter and tighter over time, and it loses a little bit of the fun aspect as you
Yeah.
do that, but it creates a game that lots more people can play without having endless arguments about rules, basically. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
I still have people lament the old losing out on the old Rogue Trader orc books,
Yeah,
if you
yeah,
remember those. Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, oh, yeah, no, I do, I do. Yes, indeed, I do.
Yeah. So yeah. And that brings up a question that I kind of wanted to ask in terms of like in obviously you're still writing rules because I think your latest one was that I can recall is Valor and Fortitude, I believe.
That's right. Yeah, yeah.
And that's
Yes.
I think it's like a much simpler version or a much simpler rule set than what most, at least most Napoleonic players are used to.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, so with that type of rule set that you put out, is it do you feel like you're just adjusting to the times in terms of like the common, or
No,
is
no.
that just
Valor Fortitude is yeah, it's a passion project for me, and so I retired from workshop about 3 years ago, and very soon after that, I was going to a war game show with Michael and Alan Perry. Who are, if we talk about Warhammer Historical, like I know
right?
you want to,
Yeah.
then they feature
Okay.
very strongly in that, and we were just chatting about things, and uh, we were playing Black Powder, and it had been a long time since I played a game with the Black Powder rules, so I was rusty, even though I basically, like, was kind of like one of the lead designers on it. And we were endlessly flipping backwards and forwards through the rule book,
Right.
trying to find things and stuff like that. So I said, I bet I could come up with a short set of rules. That we could use for when we're going to do demo games at events was the starting
Mm.
point for it. Really was, because we were at
Okay.
this Partisan War Game show, and one of the projects that I really enjoyed for Age of Sigmar was the very first version of Age of Sigmar. I was told that the rules had to fit onto 4 sides of A4 paper.
Right. Yes.
Right there, so that was the starting point for and that was the project got compromised in the end for various reasons, which aren't really worth going into here. But I still really enjoyed the idea of keeping the rules that tight, because it makes you have to be very disciplined about
Yeah.
the amount of rules you put in. So, but that had been heavily rewritten, and a lot of the things that I wanted to do, I hadn't been allowed to do with the first edition Age of Sigmar rules. So I said to Michael and Anna, well, like, why don't I do this? And I gave me the opportunity to kind of go back to that kind of idea and say,
Right.
okay, I want to do a set of rules. I want them to, and the first edition Age of Sigmar rules, we were talking earlier on about having rules that have what I'd call hand waving. It would be kind of like the players had to figure out how to make the game work themselves.
Hmm.
Um, uh, and I didn't really think that was a good idea, but it ended up in the rules anyway. And so with Valor and Fortitude, I wanted to prove that to myself as much as anybody, that I could write the rules and that I didn't have to hand wave anything. They were 4 pages long, but they were complete.
Hmm.
And I think it's taken me sort of like 3 years now to kind of get to the stage, but I'm pretty sure that they're complete. They have a lot. What I've done is I've written quite a lot of FAQs to go along with them, and designers commentary, really,
Hmm.
because the rules are so tight. Sometimes people have questions, and although the answer is on the page, they don't quite believe it. If you know what I mean, it's
Yes.
they don't say,
I
"Would you
understand
agree?"
that exactly. Yes.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's that kind of thing. You say, "Yeah, do you really mean this?" And yes, I really do mean that. Basically,
Yeah.
is my answer to most of these things, and a little bit of an explanation of why I've gone the route that
Yeah.
I have. But actually, the rules themselves are complete, and they fit onto 4 pages. And so it was a little kind of like a design puzzle for me, basically.
Okay.
And it was really nice to have something where I didn't have to basically worry about anybody else other than myself when I was writing the rules. So the Michael and Alan were happy for me to do whatever I wanted.
Hmm.
And at workshop, there are a lot of stakeholders involved in every set of rules that you
Yeah.
work on. It's a big business thing now. So if you're working on, particularly if you're working on 40k, but Age of Sigmar 2, there are lots of people who quite rightly have an interest in how the rules are written,
Yeah.
the way they're presented. So you go along to a lot of meetings and discuss things
Yeah.
and then have stuff bounced back, and
Yeah.
things
Yeah.
like that. And you don't always get your own way. So it's quite nice to be able to get my own way.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember. I think shortly. I think the file after Age of Sigmar, the I think that's when they had eighth edition of 40k, and that's when they did theirs on. I think it was 8 pages,
Yeah.
a pamphlet on that one, and that was the big thing. And I enjoyed it because everything was just on the pamphlet. Everything was there. I didn't have to, like you said, I didn't have to flip through a book. Maybe have to look at it. I think at the time it was an index, so I maybe had looked at the index book for my army,
Hmm.
and then that's all you needed really was the pamphlet, your index book, and your models, and that was it, and tape measure and dice and all that other stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, you briefly mentioned historical. Excuse me. You briefly mentioned historical, Warhammer Historical. And that's the main reason I have you on, because, like I said, uh, everyone does interviews, and I watch them all. But I do notice, and this is, like I said, selfish of me because I loved Warhammer Historical at the time, just like I love Specialist games. I played all the Specialist games, even Inquisitor.
Right. Okay.
uh,
Yeah.
and no one really asked about that, so I just really wanted to talk about Warhammer Historical. And my first question is, how did it all come about? Um,
Yeah. Sure. So it's a good question. Basically, so a lot of the original games design team at Workshop started out playing historical war games. So
yeah.
I did. I started out playing World War II games with using Airfix toy soldiers, little
Hmm.
20 mil toy soldiers. Rick Priestley the same, and the Perry twins too. And we were all friends and kind of like hanging out, talking about the old days. And I think it was Rick first. Rick had got his ancient armies, and we found a set of rules to play a game with them, which looked quite interesting. They're a set of rules called Tactica,
Oh
which they're
yeah.
huge armies, but a rather cool set of rules. I like the games designer Artie Conliffe. I think is a really good games designer. So we tried out a game of that, but uh, uh, it wasn't really very flexible Tactica. It was like it had war. If you took a Roman army, then there was one army list, and it was
Oh.
huge, absolutely enormous. And around about that time, now the one thing I should say here is we're talking about sort of like stuff from 30 odd years ago, and
Yes.
so this is my memory of things, which isn't necessarily absolutely the truth, and other people remember things slightly differently. So just with that in place, as I remember it, the Perrys they were allowed to do kind of like historical miniatures on the side, basically. Workshop said, yes, okay, you can do historical miniatures on the side, because there was no stopping them, really. They were just going to do them anyway. Either Michael or Alan, I can't remember which one, had come up with a range of late Romans and Picts that they were doing, which was very cool. And they said they were going to a war game show and they were going to do a demo game, and we were chatting about it. And I said, like, I bet I could do some Warhammer army lists. Around about that time, it was around about the time of fourth edition Warhammer, I think, and I've been working on that. Well, I said, I bet I could come up with some army lists for these, and so I did. I came up with a set of late Roman and a set of picked army lists and we just used the Warhammer Fourth Edition rulebook and those army lists,
Okay.
and the game just worked really well. Basically, and we didn't. I think the thing I remember about the time was we didn't expect it to, because I think we'd been kind of like there'd been so much stuff at the time. Historical war gamers really looked down their nose at Warhammer.
Mm.
It was always
Yeah.
unrealistic. It's silly. It's all kind of like all these dice rolls and things like that. It can't possibly be a realistic simulation of ancient battles and things like that. No, 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 no. And so we weren't we were and we'd kind of almost believed that. Basically, people say it to you enough, you believe it. And so we played this game. We thought, actually, this is really good. It feels great. It feels like an ancient battle to us, and it's a great little game system. And it's got it had a lot of character to it.
Hmm.
We were able to do. I think I came up with city rules for the shaman. They were picked shamans or something like that, and and I've got stuff for that in there. So that kind of like trundled along, and I ended up. I think I wrote it up. I wrote it up as an article for one of the historical war games magazines. And there's a fantastic magazine called Slingshot,
Yeah.
published by the Society of Ancients, and I think I wrote some stuff for that. But we managed to convince Games Workshop via Rick primarily, as I remember, that it would be a good thing if they let us publish these rules as Warhammer Ancient Battles, basically. And we managed to get permission to do a historical version of the Warhammer rules. It was on the understanding that it didn't distract us from doing like our day job,
Right.
basically, doing fantasy and science fiction games and things. So again, a little bit like the Blood Bowl thing, I ended up again doing a lot of writing and games design in my spare time. The Perrys were making the miniatures. I think Rick really helped a lot with the editing in particular and coming up with ideas for the rules. And we managed to put together a rule book in the end and get it out there. And then we used to have to sell it and distribute it ourselves.
Oh, wow.
So at lunch times, but Workshop said that we could use the mail order department to send things out, and we were able to use the accounts department to handle all the invoicing and stuff, but we had to do the
Oh,
rest. So we'd go off at lunchtime and pack up all these boxes and then send them directly to customers, and quite a few of them off to, like trade shops and things like
yeah.
that, people who wanted to distribute them. And the first print run sold out really, really quickly, much more quickly than we really thought it was going to, and so we were off then. Basically, it just kind of snowballed from there.
Oh, okay. Yeah, because I know I remember buying it, the original, yeah, Ancient Battles. Um, and I think I was able to get people to play because, especially if they played Empire or Bretonians in
Hmm.
fantasy, it was a lot easier to convince them to play. Where it's just like, I mean, it might be a oversimplification, but I just described it as fantasy battle, but without the fantasy part,
Yeah, yeah.
because
Well, that's really what it was. Yeah,
it was so
yeah,
similar. It was just you just take out certain elements on a,
yeah.
there's more to it, in order to get them to play,
Hmm.
because they were at the time, because I mean, we played with Games Workshop, so the prices are at a slightly larger scale than other
Yeah,
manufacturers. So allow them to not have to invest in a whole new army. Um,
no, that's right. And that there was definitely a lot of that going on. I think you've got people crossing over from Warhammer Fantasy, from fantasy Warhammer
yeah,
and giving the game a try. But there does seem to be a ready market out there on the historical side too. I think the rules at the time. Again, this is my memory. A lot of the ancients rules that were around. I mean, you got DBA and
yeah,
DBM, but they were really good for 15 mil
right, yeah,
games. Basically, that was their where most people focused in. And you didn't get very many kinds of like ancients rules where you had individually based models and the armies looking the way that Warhammer Ancient Battles or Warhammer armies looked.
yeah,
Um, and there's just kind of like a feel and a look to that style of game, which I think had been around in the historical wargaming hobby and had just kind of disappeared from sight for a little bit at around
mm,
about that time. So I think we were lucky in that we gave people who liked the look of that style of game and already were into historical wargaming an opportunity to play
yeah.
games in that kind of way. And I think that a lot of them were pleasantly surprised with like how accessible the rules were and quite enjoyed the games
Yeah,
basically.
I don't recall a big a game set of rules at that scale at that time, because like at the time I played,
Mm.
if I played historicals, it was DBA,
Yeah.
um, because it was 15 millimeter. It's easier to paint and to gather an army,
Mm.
even though it's 12 12 elements. uh, Um,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
um, but yeah, I don't remember unless you had rule sets like you had Tactica from like the early '90s, maybe.
Yeah, no, Tactical was. I think Tactical was like Warhammer Ancient Battles on acid. Basically, it was.
Yeah,
It
because
was.
I
They
had
were
that rule
really
set,
big games.
and
Yeah, yeah.
it was very intimidating.
Oh
Uh,
gosh, almighty! It looked great. It was.
yes.
Yeah, and I have to say as well, I think that I mean DBA and DBM are brilliant games. I really enjoy. I particularly enjoy DBA.
Yeah, me
There's
too.
something very elegant and neat about it, and I love the way that he does. Phil Barker does so many armies with basically just having 12 different units.
Yeah.
That's It's just genius stuff. It really
I
is. And
I played there was an online version of DBA that but I don't think it's around anymore. That I used to play that a lot, and
yeah,
it was through the Fanaticus forums, which is still
hmm
around, but the DBA online is not anymore. And that you could try out any army, but I think it was version 1.2 of DBA, not 2.0 at the time. This was
okay.
before 3.0, so but that was a lot of fun, especially because it was online, and they did tournaments and things like that. But again, that and whatever rule sets you had from the early '90s was probably all that was there at the time. And so when Ancient Battles came along for me, it was like, and it was Games Workshop. So at the time, I was a bit more into Games Workshop. I didn't play
hmm
anything else. And Ancient Battles gave me that Game Workshop, almost like Specialist Games. It gave me that Games Workshop adjacent. It's not the main line, but it's also still, and in my mind at the time, produced by Games Workshop.
Yeah.
Even though now I know it was it was lunchtime
Well,
produced.
well, yeah, but I mean, we were all full-time employees at Workshop, and we had access to editors and
Hmm.
like graphic design facilities and things like that.
Right.
So yeah, it was. I mean, it was near as damn it a Games Workshop game. It was just done in a slightly more hand-to-mouth kind of way.
You're right. Yeah, and as far as I know, there's still tournaments played today using Ancient Battles.
I guess there might be. I'm not sure. I
I've
wouldn't
seen.
be surprised.
Yeah, I mean,
The rules,
yeah.
they don't change. I mean, but again, I think that there are plenty of. I mean, there's Hail Caesar around now, and
Yes.
To the Strongest. All right,
To the
they're the one
Strongest.
with the grid.
They just came out with I believe it's Midgard is the latest
Yes,
one.
yeah, that's yes.
Midgard just came
It's got
out.
a full circle kind of thing there,
Yeah,
isn't it?
but those are, I believe, two different scales though. They're not at the same scale as Ancient Battles. I think
Yeah,
To the Strongest is much a smaller. I think Strength and Honor is another one.
yeah,
There's a lot of smaller scale for a more, I guess, almost like Epic. They're essentially almost like Epic
mhm,
scale.
yeah.
Um, and then you have Epic from Warlord. You have the
Yeah, that's
Epic
right.
Hail
Yeah,
Epic Hail
yeah.
Season.
No, I know. Yeah,
Everybody's doing Epic now.
yeah, yeah. That is proved very popular. It really has. It's
Yeah,
interesting.
because Games Workshop has theirs, and then I think Mantic has theirs coming out. Um, I played Epic, and so I keep track. I always love that scale, so I
Mhm.
keep track of a lot of that stuff because I know that's how I know Mantic came out with one. I think Drop Zone Commander's coming out again, and they were more like about 10
Yeah, I
millimeter.
think I heard that as well. Yeah,
So it seems like there's a big resurgence in that smaller scale.
yeah, yeah.
And it happens just like I kind of noticed that trend in historical anyway, that there seems to be once there's one like Vietnam, everyone seems to be coming out with real sets for Vietnam in the last year or two.
Yeah.
So it just seems to be like that. So Warhammer Ancients comes out, you it gangbusters. It sells much better than you expected.
Yeah.
Uh, and so you start coming out with the supplements. I believe it was either Chariot Wars. No, I believe the first one
I think it might have been Chariot Wars.
was it
There's
Chariot
Armies of
Wars?
Antiquity.
Oh, it
Was
was Armies
is
of Antiquity. I think that was the
yeah,
first one, then Chariot Wars. But
yeah. 'Cause
and there's what 15?
we ended up with quite a few. I
Yeah,
think
there's
that
a lot.
the
I'm looking at the
yeah,
list, and
yeah,
it's a lot. It's much
yeah.
longer
No,
than
what?
all the other
Yeah, I
ones.
think. I mean, basically, what happened was that the I've still got a great fondness for Armies of Antiquity. It's one of my
Mm,
favourite little projects to work on. I think it's interesting because you can kind of like see some of the design elements of Alan Fortitude back there, in that the army lists are designed to fit on a 2-page spread, so everything had to
okay.
fit onto 2
Oh,
pages,
yes. Yeah, yeah.
which was a handy discipline again, and it included little special rules and stuff, and a really nice little picture that Michael Perry drew, and
Okay.
it just looked great. It was a lovely little book. And then we worked with a games designer called Nigel Stillman,
Hmm.
who was a historical wargamer too, and is actually, like he went to university and did Egyptology, really knew
Oh, okay.
about that subject, and had written several army books for Warhammer, and basically roped him in to do the first proper army book, which was
Okay.
Chariot Wars, as I remember it being. And then more army books followed on from there. People would get in touch, and what we found was that it was just becoming way too much work, really, for us to be able to cope with. Rob Broom, I think, was brought on board to basically
Okay.
take over the reins, and it was at that time that I think that Warhammer Historical was brought back in house, more or less, within Games Workshop, because we'd been running it as a separate company. And so we kind of like cut a deal with Workshop. They kind of bought it off of
Mm,
us to get it back again, and then set up a little department to run it. And at that stage, um, myself and Rick and the Perrys weren't really involved in the day-to-day running of Warhammer Historical anymore. It kind of like
okay.
it went on its own path as a department within Games Workshop, and we were fine with that, to be perfectly honest, because it had got just a bit overwhelming. Really, it wasn't what we anticipated happening at all. It had become its own little business, and we were quite happy to hand the reins on to Rob, and he did a great job over the years. Um, yeah. And you've got all of these other kind of like books and things coming out for
Yeah.
it, different kind of like game systems and things as well. It was, more than I can remember, basically. There's lots and lots of stuff that are there where, I'd be aware of it at the time and see it a bit and chat to Rob about it. But,
We'll talk a
it
little bit
was
about
kind of
that.
like, yeah.
So how did you guys choose who would do what? But was it just someone approaching you and say, "Hey, I have an idea for a supplement"?
No, exactly that. Yeah, people would get in touch. There was a forum, I think. Yeah, I'm sure there was a Warhammer Ancient Battles forum where people would talk about things, and then people would basically when Warhammer Ancient Battles came out, the first real cry was for army lists. Yeah,
Mm,
people said, "Oh, we want army lists. We want army lists,"
right.
because we just sort of like said, "Well, just make it up yourself to begin with." It was just like, we don't care.
Right.
You've got everything here. Go for it, basically. But no, people wanted army lists, and so Armies of Antiquity was the way that we thought we can deal with this. Basically, we'd just do a set of army lists, and then
Hmm.
people will leave us alone. And uh, But then people really wanted army books with more historical background.
Yeah.
Some of the army lists that I wrote for Armies of Antiquity were very whimsical. I mean, the samurai army list in particular is
I remember that
famously
one. Yeah.
kind of like,
Yes.
it
Because
was basically, I love Kurosawa movies,
yes.
basically, in Seven Samurai. So it had all kinds of. It was more based on those than it
Yeah.
was any kind of
I think
historical
even
kind
you
of
think you even
fact.
mentioned that. Yeah. I think you have
No, I did. I
seven.
did say it.
I think you
You'd
had
have
seven
seven
characters.
heroes.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's right. You could have seven heroes in the army and stuff. It was, which I liked, but a lot of people kind of liked it. I thought, oh no, this is quite wrong. People would get in touch with us and say, I'm really interested in this period, and I think I could write you a proper army book, and we'd commission them to do it, basically, and
Okay.
say, yeah, go for it. Check out their stuff. The work would get sent in, we'd lay it out and print it. Um, I can't remember being involved in terror. Yeah, I mean, I think we were involved in some of the early books like
Hmm.
that, but very quickly it kind of like it we it moved. It moved on, as I say, Warhammer Historical, and became almost like a bit of Games Workshop, and
Right.
we were less involved in the day-to-day running. But I'm pretty sure that the same kind of principle applied. It was enthusiastic people you got a knowledge of the period, played the game, and were able to kind of like put together a whole army book with army lists, special rules, scenarios, and historical background, so that if you were interested in a period like the Dark Ages or whatever it might be,
Yeah.
samurai, proper samurai, and things like that, you could buy a book which had dedicated army lists that you could use.
Yeah.
Um,
I think at the end, by the end, I think it covered with all the armies covered a majority of the world essentially. I mean, there's still some like the New World wasn't covered, and you covered some. Yeah, there's the Art of War book.
mhm.
Um, so I think a lot of it was covered over the years with each book that came out. Um, and then what prompted? I'm assuming over time, with all the FAQs and errata, at some point you just have to say, hey, we need to make a new version because I know there's the what they call the 1.5 book,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
then there's the 2.0, which was
2,
the
2.0, I think, was Rob, as I
okay,
remember. I think 1.5 I was involved with. But yeah, we'd had a lot of feedback. There were things that we could tidy up within the rules,
right,
basically. And um, I think that there's a tendency for people to assume that games companies bring out new rule books to make money. And that's true to an extent, but in my experience, and particularly with Warhammer Historical, uh, you you get so many questions and things being asked that you really
hmm
feel you've got to do something about it. You have to respond,
right,
basically. And also you just kind of like you think I can do a better job actually than we did on the first edition of the game. So we were keen to kind of like fix any problems that we perceived. I have to say, after this amount of time, I can't remember what we changed, particularly from
I'm sure the player.
1.5
I'm sure the
to
players
2.
remember.
Yeah, oh yeah, no, I'm sure it caused a lot of. There will be people who say that the first edition was the best one and things. That's one of the things that you always find.
Oh yeah,
Um,
that's why I still
but
play first edition Space Hulk.
yeah, yeah, no,
There's
absolutely.
I know there was with 2.0. I think people had more issues with, but I think you guys did. No, I know you did because I bought the book. You did 2.0 of the first, not Chariot Wars, but the armies of antiquity.
Okay, okay.
And I believe
Oh,
it
yeah,
seemed like you
it's
combined a lot of different army books into that one book because it's like three times the size of the original book.
okay. No, so that would have been kind of almost after my time, really, at
Oh,
Warhammer
okay.
Historical, really.
Because
So it was.
that was towards the end, like around 2011, 2012, I think.
Yeah, yeah. I think there was, there was stuff going on then, that we weren't really that I wasn't involved with,
Right.
and I know that Michael and Alan weren't as well. So it had really kind of like become its own thing at that stage. And
Yeah.
again, as I mean, of all the years that I've worked with Workshop, so I've worked on, so Blood Bowl was my original games design and stuff
hmm
like that. And you can say that the same kind of like thing with Warhammer Ancient Battles, um, that you know that it's not yours. It belongs to Games Workshop,
Yeah.
and you work on it, and then at some point or another you hand the baton on, and somebody else keeps on going. The latest version of Blood Bowl, I know the games design team. They're really good. They've done a fantastic job.
Yeah. People seem to
But
enjoy it. Yeah.
I don't know. Well,
Yeah.
I think that it's still. I mean, it's basically an evolution. It's not terribly different
Yeah.
to third
Yeah.
edition, really. Uh, but even if it was different, that would be fine by me because
Mm.
you can't feel precious about that kind of stuff. It's you just you hand stuff on and other people take it on, keep on going. And I had I didn't have the brain space or enough time to be able to be able to kind of look after all of those game systems all
Yeah.
of the time. You just have to let them go in the end. And as a creative person, I think that yeah, I really enjoy the starting bit of it all. It's the initial bit of games design is always the most fun when you're like coming up with
Right.
ideas and doing things.
Yeah. Play
That's
testing and
the
all that.
best bit. Yeah.
The so Warhammer Ancient Battles is off and running. Uh, Did you decide what other eras to do? Like next up was, I believe, Legends of the Old West.
No, no, that was all after our time, really.
Okay.
So yeah, I think that I mean, basically, what you know, myself and the Perrys, the original team, as it were, Rick, were involved with Warhammer Ancient Battles for the early years, up to I think version 1.5,
Okay.
and even the army books and things that came after that. We were only, we generally gave them an edit and kind of looked over them, but we didn't really want to change anything. So we were very hands off at that stage. Um, Games Workshop took over running Warhammer Historical and set up a department to do it with its own team, basically running
Okay.
things, and they did a great job. And all of those kind of like um, the different game systems like Legends of the Old West and stuff like that were happened then.
Okay.
And around about that stage, what myself and the Perrys and Rick were still playing games around at the Perrys, but that's when we started to get into doing the black powder stuff. So it was, that we'd kind of like, and I would have guessed that would have. I'm trying to think when it was that we really started doing black powder things. It would be after Warmaster came out through Workshop. Um,
Yeah, because War Master came out, and then they did an Ancients version, a War Master Ancients.
yeah, yeah.
Because I noticed that Legends of the Old West had the same rules rules set up as uh,
It's
Lord,
the
Lord of the
Lord of the
Rings.
Rings battle
Yes,
strategy game. Yes, yeah,
which
absolutely.
helped with the transition between the two. Because
Yeah,
if someone
yeah,
played one, you can tell, well, it's just like this, and
yeah,
it was a lot easier to get people to play.
yeah, yeah,
Because I played that one a lot too,
yeah.
with my
Well, it's a
buddies.
great game system. I think that I mean Rick has designed the original Lord of the Rings battle strategy game, and I think it's like that and War Master are two great game systems.
Yes, yeah.
And then the Legends of the Old West kind of I thought it was a clever way of kind of like reskinning the Lord of the
Yes,
Rings
yeah.
system for that. And then there was a Pirates version of it, as I remember, wasn't
I
there?
believe that
And
was Legends of the High Seas,
yeah, yeah,
which was just after. Then my personal favorite, because I've always had an interest in the Great War, was the Great War.
yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and then then they did Trafalgar, which was more
Yep.
like just because High Seas was more like you said, like Legends of the Old West was more the individual models, the
Yeah.
people,
Yeah.
and Trafalgar was more the ships, or it was the
Hmm.
ships. And
It
then you
was.
guys,
Yes. Yeah.
then there was a Gladiator one,
Yeah.
which I have the rule book, but I have not tried yet. And then I always have trouble pronouncing this. It's the World War II one. Kampf, Kampfgruppe
Oh,
Normandie.
God, yes, yes, yeah, no, absolutely. That was Warwick Kinraid,
Yes.
who went on to do his own version, set up his own little company and
Yeah.
things, and do things. That was right at the tail end
Yeah,
of
because now
Warhammer Historical. Yeah,
we're getting towards the end. Because then was Waterloo, and then the last one was Richtofen's Flying Circus.
okay,
They did supplements for a couple of them. Well, just two of them. Just Legend of the Old West. There's a few supplements. Uh,
yeah,
Warhammer Ancients. There's the two army books, Ancient and
yeah,
Medieval,
yeah,
and then Great War is the Over the Top, which is that supplement. I think that
yeah,
was it, other than the Warhammer Ancient Battles. And the only reason
yeah.
I bring those up is because I'm kind of on a quest to almost like Pokemon. I gotta catch them
Okay,
all.
you want to get all of the
I'm trying.
different.
I'm trying.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
can get most
I
of. I
understand.
can get like 99% of them. Over the Top is one that's hard to find because it was printed, I think, like at the very tail end,
Okay,
as well as
okay,
Richtofen's Flying Circus. I was able to
yeah,
find Over the Top for a very low price, considering some of the prices I've seen.
yeah.
And then Richtofen's Flying Circus hardly ever comes up because I think
Right,
that was a
okay.
limited print run.
Yeah, I can't even remember seeing it actually, to be perfectly honest myself. So it was. I mean, basically, I think at the time, I'm trying to think when do you remember what year that was? You got the
2012
numbers.
was essentially the
2012. Yeah,
last year of Warhammer Historical. So I don't know
yeah,
if
it
you
would have
know
been.
anything about them shutting it down.
I think that again, this is I wasn't involved, so it was, but at the time, Workshop was consolidating.
Hmm.
It was and focusing. The company got very sprawling. And it got
Right.
lots of different things going on. So there was a desire to focus in on Warhammer and 40k,
Okay.
and not let ourselves get distracted with other projects. And it, yeah, and so it was a period of kind of consolidation and refocusing back in onto our core business.
Hmm.
And I think at the time there was you know Workshop had been doing brilliantly well, and we kind of hit a little bit of a doldrums, before it managed to pick back up again.
Right.
And so I think it was probably involved slightly with that. But the primary thing was there was a lot of stuff going on about, like we've been doing all of these different things. We really need to, they're just distractions. They don't make us terribly much money,
Right.
and they can
Right.
actually distract us from doing the thing that does. So there was a desire to kind of like focus in on those things, and Warhammer Historical it did fine, but it wasn't up there with the fantasy and
Y-
science fiction stuff.
Yeah.
It was just a little mini business,
And
really.
then at that time, you also had Middle Earth
Yeah,
strategy battle. That was
yeah.
because the movies. Because it's funny because I worked at New Line at the time when those movies were coming out.
Okay.
Uh, and
Okay.
this is
Cool.
already a few years after the Return of the King, almost 10 years. Jesus,
Yeah,
it's a long time ago. So I can see that
yeah,
because I know
yeah.
and I usually measure time at this point when it comes to Games Workshop by what edition of 40K was going on at the time. I think that was like fifth edition. They're in the middle of fifth edition at the time. Um,
It's
yeah, I
difficult
think it
to
was the middle of
remember
fifth,
exactly.
right
Yeah.
before sixth edition came around. Because sixth edition was 2015, I think,
Okay.
2016.
Yeah, yeah. The
Um,
years tend to kind of like merge together for me. I'm
yeah, they
really
do.
rubbish at being able to remember which year things happened
That's why I
in.
use
It,
40K editions to to
it's
to
not a
measure
bad idea.
time.
It's not a bad, yeah, no, not a bad idea at all.
But
Um,
yeah, so that basically, so like yeah, so trying to find the books is
yeah,
it's
no, so but no, it's fun. I do understand that. I just I occasionally I do the thing where I got all of the
yeah.
WRG ancient battles, ancient
Okay.
rule books.
Yeah. Yeah.
I've
Yeah.
managed to get all the way back to second edition
Oh
version of
wow.
that. First edition is
Okay.
very difficult to get hold of.
Yeah,
Um,
Richthofen's is the same. It doesn't come up very often, and when it does, you kind of have to be quick to grab it.
yeah,
Otherwise, you
yeah.
gotta wait again. So it's over the top showing up a lot more, and the prices vary. I've seen it from like $100 to I think one place was trying to sell it for like 500.
Yeah.
Um, but I was able to get it for pretty good. And all the other ones are relatively you can find. It's not that hard to find the main books. Again, it's in the market it always goes up and down whether people
Yeah.
decide to sell it or not. Um, okay, yeah, I was just curious about towards the end, and it kind of makes sense with just GW consolidating everything because I think that's the same time they kind of shrank the specialist games.
Yeah, yeah, and a Fanatic got shut down as
Yeah, and
well,
all
which
that.
was
Yeah,
a thing that was that was tough. And because obviously there was one of the other distractions for me was that I was heavily involved with the specialist games
right.
range,
Yeah,
really. Um, and So yeah, several bits and pieces like that went away. And I think that there's it's in a way, it's a shame that they did, but it's
yeah,
kind of like the nature of businesses. Basically, things like that just happen. Yeah, like you've got different people with different points of view about stuff, and you can argue whether they were right or wrong, but it's what happened. Really, and
yeah.
that was the end of it.
The so so we can move off Warhammer Historicals because I have to do a few other questions. I know, like you mentioned,
Yeah.
you did Fanatic games, specialist games. You did Epic Space Marine or Epic 40K.
Mhm.
Like I mentioned, Inquisitor. There was a number of side games and board games, like you mentioned, Space Hulk. And is there a game in general? Let's on GW and the Games Workshop games that you helped design and create. Do you have a favorite?
A favorite. Uh, um, uh, uh, I wouldn't say that I particularly got a favourite. I've got a couple of answers to that, I suppose.
You can have more than one.
Um, yeah,
Yeah,
I
I
think
know
that.
we love all our children equally.
Well, I think that there's that, but there's, when you're a like yeah, I spent my career at Games Workshop, the vast majority of it after I'd moved on from trade sales was as a games designer.
Yeah.
And if you're going to do a good job as a games designer, you have to be able to really fall in love and get passionate about the
Mhm.
project that you're working on. And so, more often than not, the thing that you were most excited about and that you felt the best about was the last thing that you worked on. It's just the nature of things. If you're doing your job right, that's the way that you're going to feel about it.
Right.
You've got to be able to get excited. So it's difficult, therefore, to pick out a favourite. Now that being said, there was years and years ago somebody asked, if you could only have one Games Workshop game, what would it be?
Mm.
And I think what I said then, and I think it's probably still true now, actually, is that I'd probably go for Warhammer.
Oh,
Warhammer
okay.
Fantasy as being the one game that I'd keep, because there's just something about. I've got particularly fond memories of playing Warhammer fourth, fifth
Okay.
edition. Yeah, it was the height of the battle report time. It looked great, and obviously Warhammer Ancient Battles was basically using the same game
Yeah.
system. There's just something about it. The look of the armies and the scenery, it felt like a proper battle to me. So I've got a very soft spot for those, but I've also got soft spots for Space Hulk, which I think is an absolutely
Yeah.
fantastic game. I really, really like it. The various different editions of Epic, but particularly the Epic Armageddon, which I think is probably one of the best sort of like rule books that I've written. And interestingly, and from later on, the third edition Age of Sigmar rulebook, which I was very pleased with. That was just a great project to work on, but for a completely different reason. It was we had it was we had a really good team of people were working away at it, and we put a lot of work in on really kind of like getting the rules to be tight. And as error free as we could possibly get them, and I think it's probably for such a big game, it's one of the best rule
Mhm.
books that I'd worked on in that kind of way. So there are various different projects that I kind of pick out. And they kind of like I remember them very fondly.
Okay.
But fortunately for me, I don't have to pick one of them. Yeah, I can, like enjoy them all. Yeah, like fairly equally, really.
Is there one you still like would like to go back and like? Oh, I know. Like with artists, they always want to tweak
Well,
something. Is there one you still want to go would like to go back or wish you could go back and just do a little
so
something extra
that's
too?
an interesting question. Uh, I don't know. I think interesting. I think I almost always got the opportunity to do it because Games Workshop, if it does one thing, it does new editions
Yes.
thing. So I did get a lot of opportunity to go back and do things.
Right.
And by the time I left, I have to admit, starting to get a little burnt out on codexes and army books. I'd be like,
Mm,
oh, how many times have I worked on the Eldar Codex? I don't know,
right.
or whatever it might be. But one project that I learned a huge amount from was a game called Advanced Space Crusade.
Oh
So
yes.
this is going right back. So Milton Bradley, Hasbro as they are now, had brought out Space Crusade, and as part of the deal with that, we got to do an advanced version of the game, and I got to design it, and I made this overly complicated, sprawling kind of like game. It was verging on unplayable, I'd say, looking back at it. It really didn't do terribly well at all. Yeah, quite rightly, I would say. Workshop ended up with lots of spare bits and pieces left over from that. We had lots of components, and I ended up having to do a much simplified version of the game to try and help move those things through, which became a game called Tyrannid Attack. Um,
Yes, like I have that
and
game.
yeah, but that was a very important. Going from one to the other was a very important learning experience for me, because what I found was that Tyrannid Attack, although it was loads simpler, actually had almost all. It was just as a compelling and as an
Hmm.
interesting game as the much more complicated version
Yeah.
of the game that I'd done before. And I think that's when I started to change from being a kind of like more or less an amateur games designer. I was learning as I was going along to one who was more thoughtful about the process. And so Tyrannid Attack directly led to the work that I did on Blood Bowl Third Edition.
Okay.
And I took a lot of the lessons there, and arguably Blood Bowl is the yeah I'm the best game I'm going to design. It's just like I was lots of things came together there, but I'd learned a lot from Tyrannid Attack. So the mistakes I made on Tyrannid Attack, being able to learn from them and get that opportunity to kind of like do a simplified version, yeah, it was really very helpful for
Hmm.
me as being able to consolidate my thinking on the way that I went about designing games. And I think so. You'll see that what I try to do when I design games is to use the simplest mechanics I can to achieve the effect that I want. So
Okay.
I keep in mind the effect that I want, what I want the game to capture, and then I say, what's the simplest way I can achieve that? Now, that's different from trying to design a simple game.
Right.
It's you've got to be clear in your first of all, you have to set your goals. What am I trying to achieve? And then you constantly look at what you've written down and you say, could this be a bit simpler? Could I do it in a slightly different way? How can I do that? And I think that's why, with Valor and Fortitude, I was so interested with the idea of the 4-page rules, because they force you to kind of like think like that, that
Okay.
getting that clear kind of like goal in mind and then constantly working to refine it down as best you can. It came out from designing a game which was the total opposite of that.
Right.
Yeah.
Is there as you mentioned, you're now designing a lot of historical games with Warlord and I believe other manufacturers. But is there one uh, time period or era that you haven't done yet that you would like to do?
Well, so it's funny you should say that. Actually, as well, this is something of an exclusive, because I've only really just started working on it this year. Is that I've been working on a World War II version of based off the Valor and Fortitude rules for World
Oh,
War II. So
okay.
we had our first playtest game about 2 weeks ago. We travelled off to Sicily in World War II,
Nice.
with Michael and Alan, and the game didn't work, as first versions of games never do. But
Right.
I've got it gave me plenty of food for thought, and so the plan is to kind of like develop that up and hopefully get it into War Games Illustrated later on this year, maybe as a
Okay.
free set of rules.
I'll look forward to it.
And I love World War II stuff. That's how I started wargaming. As I said right at the beginning of the podcast, my first war games were playing
Mm.
World War II games with their fixed toy soldiers. So, having a chance to actually, like kind of like look up what's the difference between a Mark III H and a Mark III L.
Right.
So I'm loving it. I love that
Okay.
kind of stuff. And then how can I reflect that in the games in the simplest possible way
Yeah.
achievable? Really.
I look forward to
So
seeing that.
yeah.
Yeah, but I think that's all I have for today. I'll probably remember more questions after this interview. So just usually the case for me, where I should have asked him this. But I do
That's great.
appreciate you coming on, especially because I just kind of messaged you out of the blue. but again, thanks for coming on, and I hope to have you on. Maybe I'll have you on afterwards once you have the new game out, the new World War II.
Yeah, no, I'd be
And
happy to come back.
and talk some
Yeah,
more about going from that initial playtest and that initial idea to the final product.
absolutely. Yeah, no, that would be a fun thing to talk about.
All right. Well, thank you. And thank everybody for listening. And see you soon.